All right, well, welcome to my igloo. Oh wait, igloos are supposed to be warm, oh well. Welcome to Salon E, or whatever it's called. I'm David Black, thank you for coming. We're going to talk today about a topic I'm calling perfections and the business cycle. I realized with some sort of horror that I don't think it's very likely I will actually use the term business cycle, but you can kind of infer it. It's all about that. I don't use the term necessarily, but still. Okay, just quickly a little bit about me. I work at 2U. I'm in their New York office doing tech dev. If you don't know 2U, it's a cool company, 2U.com. I am the author of The Well-Grounded Rubyist, most recent edition 2014. And I have spoken many times here at Philly ETE. I happened to be putting together a list, so I thought, you know what, I'm kind of proud of this record. I think I'll share it with everyone. And actually, no less a light than Tracy Wilson-Rossman believes that I hold the record for the most talks here. Notice there are 2 in 2010. I really pitched in that year. This is a great conference. I hope you've noticed that. I don't know how many of you are speakers or have been here before or whatever, but it's really a really good conference. And in the year between now and next year, you should, talk it up, because I know you will have had a really good and interesting time here. Chariot Solutions just puts on a great event. Okay, I'm going to begin a little bit in the past with a couple of words from Paul Valéry, a critic and poet, of whom my friend, who is, I think, the head of modern languages at the University of Glasgow or something, said, when I asked him about, quotations and translations and so on, he said, nobody really studies him anymore. Whoops. But anyway, I found a quotation that really resonates with me. It's a little long, but I am going to read it because it's kind of the entry point to this entire talk. He's talking about essentially artists, probably poets, but other artists also. In the eyes of those lovers of perfection, a work is never finished, a word that for them has no sense, but abandoned. And this abandonment, whether to the flames or to the public, and which is the result of weariness or an obligation to deliver, is a kind of accident to them, like the breaking off of a reflection which fatigue, irritation, or something similar has made worthless. Valéry also said this, or it's been paraphrased. I don't know if he said it more concisely, but you'll sometimes hear the quotation, a work of art is never finished, it's just abandoned, kind of the short version of this, which this is the long version, apparently. Okay, what's in this for us? All right, imagine you're a software developer, probably not much of a stretch for at least some of you, and you are working on a project, and you're thinking, I have to stop because the business side says it's due, right? A work is never finished, but abandoned, which is the result of an obligation to deliver. So that's the thing. That's what resonates in this quote for me, is the question of, as a software developer, engineer, programmer, do I ever feel like I've really finished a program? Do I ever feel like I've really done everything, sort of chiseled every little bit, written the last note, absolutely perfect? And Valéry's contention that no artist really feels that is really interesting to me, because I don't generally. So where does this quotation leave us? All right, so our subject matter, getting sort of down to earth here, our subject matter, we're talking about developers who want to improve / refactor code, and often legacy code. That if you've been in this position, you start in on a project that other people have worked on, and you look at the code, and it takes you 4 days to figure out what's going on, and you know that the next person to look at it is going to take 4 days unless you rewrite it in some way or refactor it dramatically. The business stakeholders, the product people, whose sort of counter argument when you say, well, if I put in whatever, 5 days on this code, it'll save you 4 days every few months when someone else has to figure out the code. But the business people will say, and I'm not making fun of this, I completely understand this, they will say, well, but it works. You know, we don't have 5 days of your time, or whatever it is, to work on code that actually works. We have to have you do something else. So developers then, with Valéry, we feel we're abandoning the code, right? The code, it's not really finished. Yeah, it works, but there's more to do. There's maybe much more to do. And so we feel we're abandoning the code, but the business doesn't see it as premature abandonment because the code actually works. So this is a sort of who's right, which, by the way, I mean, it's more, I want to explore it. I don't have kind of an exact answer to that question. But we're going to just probe into this a little bit. Why listen to one side and not the other? How can they work together? What are the circumstances that allow for that, and so on. Okay, part one. By the way, there, just so you know this doesn't go on into infinity, there, I believe I have 5 parts, so-called, which is just an organizational principle. They're fairly short. There will be time, I hope, I think, for discussion and questions later. Okay, the landscape, meaning what are the elements here that we're talking about? What are the characters in this drama? Okay, programming. Now, yes, I could call that software engineering, software. We'll hand wave at that. I'm calling it programming. And then we have business, which is again my kind of blanket term for the people on your team or in your company who represent the business side, the product side, and so on. Interestingly, in my opinion, we also are dealing with art. And this is, again, taking my cue a little bit from Valéry. I believe we are talking about, when we talk about software, I believe we are talking about an art. That's a very complex thing to say, and I'm not the first to say it, but, and I'm not gonna plumb all the depths, but still, that would be my, my starting point. And finally, we're also talking about time. I've really put myself on the hook for some real profundities. You know, like I have to explain the nature of art and time, but I'm not going to. I'm going to take some of that for granted. But this is about to turn into a Venn diagram. Okay, so business and programming. They overlap a lot, obviously. I think it's fairly commonplace. And then we have art and business and programming. And of course, art and business have a very complex and very long-standing relationship. Business and programming have a very close relationship. Really, the programming and art overlap is probably the one that people might sort of raise an eyebrow at. Maybe not. I don't know, I may be sort of borrowing trouble here, but you know, there is The Art of Computer Programming by Donald Knuth, and no, I don't claim to have read it cover to cover. But essentially, in thinking about programming as an art, I think of it kind of in comparison to other arts. Programming is interesting in this light because it has to be perfect. It's nothing if it's not perfect. It doesn't have to be beautiful, but it has to work perfectly. And that, of course, is the engineering side. If you think about architecture, for example, architecture has to work, or you get Galloping Gertie, or whatever that bridge was, over the Tacoma Narrows that went down in a windstorm, right, in 19 whatever. So yes, this is an engineering matter, but I think in terms of the overlap between programming and art, again, it's an unusual thing. If you think about something like painting, right? Painting, it's completely arbitrary, right? There's no right or wrong place to put the oil. It doesn't even have to be oil, right? There's no rules. There are traditions and there are practices and conventions, but there's nothing bad happens other than you might not have a successful career if you paint kind of at random. So yeah, so software in that sense is very different from other arts. But it has in common, I think, the fact that it's kind of inexhaustible. I mean, you know, art is long and our lives are short, as they said in ancient Rome or wherever. You never get to the bottom of an art. You never, you know, there's something you may have seen sort of floating around the internet, which is a quotation from the great cellist Pablo Casals, who lived into his 90s. And somebody asked him when he was in his 90s, "Maestro, why do you still practice the cello?" And he said, "Because I think I see some improvement." And that was after, 89 years or whatever of playing. So yeah, art is inexhaustible, programming is inexhaustible, which is one thing I like about it. That kind of keeps my interest. So let's assume that we have this is kind of an idealized Venn diagram, but where we're at is kind of the intersection of all of these things. And let me say a little bit more about time. Time plays, to me, a really odd role in the software development field. What I mean by that is, as far as I can tell, it's all about time. Everything that matters to business and a lot of what matters to developers is about time. How long is this going to take? How much can we get done by the end of the week? When is our release cycle? Blah, blah, blah. It's all time. What's strange to me is we have this sort of, I don't know if it's a cognitive dissonance or something, it's kind of weird relation to time that we're sort of skittish about actually saying that we're talking about time. We give things points based on complexity. I'm not really sure what that is, and it's sometimes sort of taboo to say, well, I think this will take a day and a half. No, how complex is it? How far are you from knowing how to do it? A day and a half? I don't know. So it all kind of reduces or resolves to time. And this is probably some major gap in my knowledge or thinking, because there must be more to it. But every time I discuss anything like this, it always ends up being about time, but people don't always want to say that, and I'm not sure why. Well, one reason is that it's utterly impossible to estimate time. And, I've had years of estimating whether we call it time or complexity or whatever, and many, many conversations at the end of an iteration about how, well, the estimates didn't really work and this to the point where I'm really, this is kind of a sidebar, but I'm really thinking we need kind of a whole new way to go about that. And maybe there are ways that I just haven't, picked up on. But yeah, it's totally unpredictable. But then again, everything's unpredictable, right? We say tomorrow and the gods laugh and all that. We say our release cycle ends in a week and the gods laugh. Everything, complexity is unpredictable and time is too, and so forth. Okay, but anyway, we've got our sort of four-part, sort of collage of things at whose intersection we're looking at the difficulties. And now, part two, what do I mean by perfections? This is at least a first approximation. There's nothing canonical about this. I'm going to present three, what I call perfections. One, I'm calling functional. This is essentially, it works. Functional perfection, it's just my term for it works. This is the sine qua non. There can be nothing else without this. Again, if software doesn't work perfectly, it is nothing. You can make it work perfectly later, but still, it's essentially nothing. Second perfection, I'm calling developmental, which I'm not in love with that term, but it's close as I could get. Basically, I'm referring to the process, all of the things about time, about meeting deadlines, about satisfying stakeholders, about mapping out a team or an organization's work, and sticking to that and having that work out. The third perfection, yes, sorry, I forgot. I do these little actions in PowerPoint. I forgot I did. Good velocity. Velocity is a weird term because it means speed, which means time, but it's not supposed to mean time. Anyway, yes, so whatever you call it, that. The third form of perfection I have in mind is aesthetic. Wow, that was really too low contrast a choice, wasn't it? Oh well, note to self. Anyone looking at this on wherever, that says aesthetic, okay. what do I mean by that? This is the whole, as developers, we want to do what we can to perfect our craft and our art. The code is clean, it is comprehensible, it is maintainable, and those two kind of add up to that one. Elegant, I know that's sort of a pretty mushy term, but yeah, I use it. Idiomatic, it's just, all those things that we aim for as software developers. Okay, now we have the functional, meaning the it works, the developmental, meaning it's on time. I think the it's on time one is kind of subsumed by the it works one, in the sense that if it's on time and it doesn't work, it's sort of not really there. So anyway, I'm not going to dwell, but I put those kind of one within the other. So now, where does the aesthetic fit into this? The aesthetic perfection, the thing that developers, at least a lot of us, dream about or have an ideal of. Well, at the moment in this diagram, it's floating off to the left. It hasn't really been integrated. And this is what developers fear the business side is thinking, namely that aesthetic perfection has nothing to do with getting code in on time and having it work. It's kind of a parody of the business perspective, but there it is. This, however, this is what business fears developers are thinking. That we just want to craft beautiful code and spend the morning thinking of a variable name and all this kind of thing. And we don't care about the delivery. We don't care if it doesn't. Well, we do care. Again, this is kind of a parody of I think the worst fears at the worst times of what a business person on the team or in the organization might fear is going on among the developers. Okay, so we have sort of parodies of the opposite poles. However, we'll leave it at this for the moment, that they all sort of interact in harmony. And it is a nice kumbaya moment, right? That's the ideal, the calm before the storm. But what we're forgetting is we have two Venn diagrams, one of perfections and the other one of the elements that compose this landscape. And here they are. I mean, what do you do with that, right? So much for kumbaya, right? Okay, so this is the thing. There's a lot of balls in the air or Venn diagrams in the air or whatever, and I think that's it's a knotty problem, and it bears some thinking about. So I'm going to start by looking at kind of an idealized solution or way out of this. So let's kind of rewind a little bit. We have programming and business overlapping, and somewhere in here we have the functional perfection, the it works perfection. We all agree on that. In reality, we're not arguing. Everybody thinks it should work, even if the business fears that we don't care about that, or we think they don't care about things that will make it work. So really, everybody, we share that. Everybody is in on that, definitely. Developmental, the sort of having it be on time and so forth. Oh, thank you for the capital L PowerPoint. Developmental, come on. I know I shouldn't break the line. I mean, it just did that. So now I don't have them subsuming each other. Just you can interpolate that. This is pushing my Venn diagram manipulation skills to their limit. And then the sort of not really yet harmonious or perfect one is the idea that, yeah, we share this, but there's also things about functional and developmental perfection that are in competition with aesthetic perfection, or that are somehow subsumed by that and made subordinate to it. So we don't want any disharmony, right? We want harmony. So really, we're talking about ideally everything kind of working together like this. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? And I have a story to tell you and a couple of suggestions to think about. But in practical terms, this is kind of the ideal of what it could, would, should look like. And in practical terms, that means that the idea of beautiful code or clean code and so on is understood as something that contributes to the movement forward in time of a project. That it's not something superimposed by aesthetes who just want to beautify the code, though sometimes that happens. I mean, you know, sometimes you have to be kind of pulled away from it because it's not the moment to do that particular code. But that it's something that does have an impact on or plays a role in whether the code works, whether you can tell it works, whether somebody else in a month or 6 months is going to be able to work on the code. And that to me is really a very key thing. You know, opaque and obscure and bizarrely written code you can't really approach. And everyone who does ends up wasting a lot of time. So this is, you know, kind of in a sense something to think about and to aim toward. And in the interest of that, it's story time. This is actually part 5. So this is, yes, this is an anecdote, a story that one of the things that got me really thinking about this, and also that to me illustrates a very good example of code that rewriting which paid dividends. Okay, the screen is black. And now, Dr. Black presents. And by the way, I do have a PhD, but lest you think it's in computer science, it isn't. It's in a field that's about as unrelated as it could be. That's why I don't use it. I don't use the title very much because it sounds like I'm faking something. But anyway, I stand before you, Dr. Black, and I present the controller. Any of you do Rails or other MVC? Okay, the Rails controller. That 8, New Jersey. All right, there I was, new to a consulting gig, and in New Jersey, as you might have surmised. And I walk in, and after I kind of get my bearings, one of the first things that I am shown is the Rails application that the team has been working on for quite a while, and it's quite big, and that's fine. Until we get to something called the mono controller. The mono controller was a 1,200 line Rails controller. I looked at this and I said, no, you can't do that. So, I mean, I had no authority to say that, but they got the gist. And what I did was I talked to the team. You know, we talked about it. And there were reasons presented to me for why this had happened. And for those of you who don't know, I don't know, what would you say, 10 to 30 lines? 30 might be pushing it, would be good for a control. I mean, you know, they do vary, but 1,200 is just you know, excessive in the extreme. So we talked about this at Kaizens and meetings and so on, and I said, you know, this isn't, I'm here to tell you, it's going to take me forever to understand this. This is a waste of time. And the reasons given to me for why it was done were well, they were in good faith, but they were wrong, technically. There actually had been no technical reason to do it. And what we decided was we would split this controller up into, I think it was 7 controllers. And what we did, because like I said to them, this is going to take me, you know, weeks to understand this. This is not just me being sort of skittish about understanding a long controller. This is going to waste time that you're paying for, and next consultant who comes in is going to have to do the same thing, and it's going to waste time and money. So what we did was we took the mono controller and we split it up into 7 files. They were not controllers. They were, at that point, what we called future controllers. And we had a directory under lib or somewhere, or under controllers, maybe, I can't remember, called future controllers. And we put these 7 controllers in there, except they weren't really controllers. They were still just modules that the mono controller was lifting in. But then, over a period of probably a couple of months, I was actually there for a while, as time permitted, we would go to one future controller after another and turn it into an actual controller and no longer have to load it into the mono controller. So we did, it's, sort of a kind of map reduce, map it into 7 controllers and then bit by bit kind of grind through them and process them into actual controllers. This was a success story in the sense that it really did make the code much more manageable. It was, kind of unfortunate because, as I said, my view was it hadn't had to happen, but that was kind of water under the bridge. But what it illustrated to me was it's never too late to do something like that. I mean, in other words, in this case, the code was being used by at least one team on a daily basis, so it had to be better. There are certainly times when you'll say to yourself or to your team or your manager or whatever, I had to make a little tweak to this file, and I looked at the whole file, and it's terrible, and I have to rewrite it and refactor it. And I have experiences where my manager or the team leader will say, well, you're right, it is terrible, and it's legacy code that we wish we had time to fix, but when do you think anyone's going to look at this code again? I say, well, in this case, maybe never. It's just this one little tweak. It's, well, then we don't really have, yes, it would be ideal to fix it, but we don't really have time. So there are such cases. It's not always right to say the code must be beautiful. That's the thing. It's the convergence of circumstances. It also isn't always right to say refactoring is a drain on resources, because it can actually, as I say, improve resources. It can save you money and time and so forth. So the controller at ETE New Jersey had a good ending and taught me a lot about the kind of thing I'm talking about today. All right, a few thoughts for the future. And then I'm quite near wrapping up, by the way, so I hope, if there's discussion that you'll mention things. All right, for developers, we don't want art for art's sake, which, sort of the battle cry of some movements in art and music history, but not commercial software development, not a situation where yes, you would love to spend that time making it nice, but like I said, there's reasons to make it nice and clean and maintainable and so on, but they don't obtain in every case, definitely. So the sort of just, I can't stand to leave bad code thing, yeah, a lot of the time that's important and you won't leave the bad code, but it's not going to be every time. Make it beautiful because beautiful code saves time. I mean, also because you like beautiful code. I'm not saying that that's not a factor too. But this is actually a good thing to remember, because that's also your argument when you talk to people who are discouraging you from spending the time on that code because they may not grasp that that in this particular case, it's going to save time and money. On the business end, trust developers when they tell you they have to make code more maintainable. That's the thing. It's a matter of trust. It's a matter of, hold on, managers. It's a matter of the business side realizing that the developers could be right, and could actually be correctly evaluating the situation and saying, if I spend 3 days on this, it'll save us X amount of hours and time and so forth down the road. That's not just pie in the sky, and it's not just sort of, being an aesthete. Okay, managers. Yes, that's what managers do. I'm not one and never want to be, but there are some great ones. It's a real skill that I don't have. So talk developers down from the ledge when they're refactoring purely for aesthetics. And yeah, I mean, this is important too, that you need somebody to say, no, that file is grotesque or whatever, but not this time. We have to pick our battles. We're not going to do it right now. So as developers, you have to listen to that and respect that decision. Reassure business that judging how to allocate development time is one of the things developers are good at. And I actually believe that's true. I think after years of experience, you get a pretty good sense when you look at some code and say, you look at the code itself, artistically, aesthetically clean, maintainable, whatever, find that it is wanting. And I think a lot of developers are also very good at picking up on, maybe with some input from a manager or whatever, picking up on whether this code is going to be used again at all, frequently, every day by the organization, which can, of course, be a major factor. So, it's a matter of realizing that's one of the things we tend to be pretty good at. And so we're not going to always say, if you think of this sort of three-part harmony here, as a matter of making decisions on these things, this stack, this team is not always going to say, yes, refactor the code, but it's also, I hope, not always going to say, no, we're not going to write a ticket for that because we have to get onto this and this and this. It's like, well, then get ready for this ticket to take 3 weeks because we don't understand this or whatever. So it can be very important. And with that, I thank you for your time, which I hope you find well spent. And we have time for comments, questions. Yes, and we have a microphone. Thank you, Sean.
I'll only make a quick comment because my background is computer science, but I went back to school for an art degree, graphic design, thinking it would be beneficial for web design. And I'd say that there's a little bit more science and technique and rules in art than a scientist would normally think about, in the same way that there's a little more art in programming than people might think if they're not in that profession. So,
right, no, I don't think there isn't. I think there can not be. In other words, you can wake up one morning and say, I'm just going to invent a new style of painting and do whatever you want. And it lies outside any tradition or any accumulated knowledge or whatever. But my point is just that it doesn't mean something's going to break, or, if you do that with software, if you just, I don't even know what the equivalent would be, just type letters and equal signs on a screen. I mean, you wouldn't really be a software developer. You'd just be someone typing stuff on the screen. I mean, yeah, you could argue you're not really a painter if you are just playing around with it. But that was my point, just that the stakes are a little different. But yeah, no, I mean, certainly if you think about the history of perspective, the history of color, these things are incredibly deep, scientifically and otherwise. Yes.
Yeah. How do you deal with the scenario where different developers are at different levels of perfection in terms of the aesthetics? I'm currently on a project where some are, it works, ship it. Others are sort of in the mid-range of, well, let's make sure we have tests. And then we have others that, it will literally take weeks to do a code review because the code just goes around and around. Yeah,
I don't think there's a formula or silver bullet. I think it's ideally, and this is kind of an ideal, but on a team of that kind, people would hopefully kind of influence each other over time, and that can happen. I've seen cases where once somebody writes, takes the time to write some really clean, nice looking, approachable code, and approachable is my favorite adjective, even more than maintainable, something you can actually look at and kind of get what's going on. I think once people see that, maybe again, this is kind of an ideal, but I think once people who don't do that see it, there's a fairly large percentage of people who are kind of won over to some extent by that. Now, the other side of the coin is a little harder. If you've got somebody who's very, very, I can't ship anything because it's not, absolutely. It's harder to get that person off the ledge, and say, well, but you have to. But again, it's, that if they're in a commercial, in a business setting, at some point they kind of have to, and maybe you could work out criteria, like, well, it passed this linter, so we, or whatever. That's probably not a good example because some of those I really don't like. But sort of agree upon certain conventions or practices and see if that contributes to kind of leveling it out.
I just had a few thoughts on his question. I mean, I think, in a lot of agile teams that we build, we rely heavily on that team being self-directing, but if there's a lot of contention amongst the team, a lot of butting of heads, I don't as a manager or as a lead on that team, you don't necessarily want to be dictatorial, but the one thing I will dictate is that you have a method of solving disputes. I'm not even going to dictate what that method is, but
Sorry, say that again.
Do you have a method for solving disputes amongst yourselves? If I'm not going to dictate what that is, but whether it's something democratic or something else, that you as a team have develop a means of solving your disputes amongst yourselves.
Yeah, it's difficult, and code review is something I value very highly, but it's not without its thorny problems. I mean, like for instance, GitHub now has this thing where you can sort of hit a button and they can't merge it until you approve of it. I think there's ways around it, they tell me, but to me that has the flavor of kind of holding someone's code hostage. Like, I don't like what you did, so there is no chance we will merge it until you do it as I would have done it. And I find that we don't really use that anywhere I've been, but that kind of thing is contentious, and it is hard to find a way out of that. I mean, some teams, I don't know, may not be able to solve these problems. I hate to put it that way, but it's possible that there's just people who will always kind of clash a little bit. Again, the ideal is, I guess, to kind of learn from each other. I mean, I learn a lot from my work colleagues. I tend to my first reaction to any code review is often, or any suggestion like, oh, let's not use this tool yet, let's use that, is sometimes kind of defensive, like, but this, I've been using it. But then if I listen to which I've tried to do more and more over the years, then, usually we end up with either they're right or I prevail on them or whatever. I'm kind of not answering your question with a real protocol or method, but
well, and like I said, I'm just saying that you mentioned managers running interference. I think a lot of times managers or some sort of technical lead, that role has to be filled. Somebody has to be that arbiter or enforce upon the team that they have a method of
I think that's true. And actually the best managers I've had have been, if you want to say former or part-time developer, I mean people who can sit down and look at code and listen to arguments on both sides if it comes down to that, or make some kind of determination. Okay.
Thanks a lot for your talk.
Sure.
I found your comments in the beginning about using hours over, complexity very timely for me. I just had a conversation with my manager the other day where I told him that I didn't really understand the points in complexity and much preferred, using hours, and he was really shocked that, I would say something like that. And I'm wondering, like, what I guess, what your advice would be for someone who's trying to sort of adapt from, previously using hours to complexity and how to sort of fit into that type of team.
Yeah, well, as you can tell from my remarks, I'm far from having really adapted to it. I mean, I participate in the estimations at place, and this goes back a while. It's not just where I am now, but throughout recorded history. I've always participated in those, under sort of mild internal protest, sort of like, partly because I don't know what I'm contributing to the discussion. It's like, okay, I can say that's a 2 or whatever, but I've been through a lot of 2s that took forever, and in the end, like I say, in the end, it all reduces to time. It's like, why didn't that ticket work? Because it turned out to be too complex? No, because it took 2 weeks. It's always, in the end, it really is about, as far as I can tell. So yeah, I don't know, I would say either stay under the radar, or that's not good, or I don't know, it depends on the dynamics of your team. I've been on some teams where I'm free to kind of discuss this, and if there, I've had agile coaches at organizations with whom I've, gone back and forth in some interesting discussions and so forth about, well, you say that eventually like a 1-point ticket will mean the same thing as each other, they'll all be, so they'll be the same size, right? And I say, size, what does that mean? If it doesn't mean how long they take, what does it mean? So there's this weird kind of, the word cognitive dissonance, that's not what I mean, but sort of disjuncture or something among the terminology, that still confuses me. But yeah, I mean, if you can open a dialogue about it without, sticking your neck out, again, it depends on the dynamics of your job and so on, but I think it's kind of interesting and potentially important.
Thanks.
Was there, yes, 2 rows back.
Thanks. So going back to the discussion around managers and running interference and kind of understanding the trade-offs between business and the programming, kind of what you talked about in your whole talk was that they're intertwined. They're not independent. And part of me wonders if part of the problem that we have is that we treat business and programming, or the technical side, as 2 different things, when really they're not. Like, you just have a business, and if your business is making software, then the business decisions and the trade-offs that are involved are completely interlocked with the technical decisions and the trade-offs that are involved. And it's that whole distinction, treating them as 2 different circles in the first place, that causes the problem. I don't know if there's a real question, but yeah, it's kind of what I'm thinking about
it's an interesting point. I mean, I think the tendency to divide them is rooted in, I suppose, traditions about job descriptions and career paths and so on, that you're not going to get a company where, or maybe there are, I don't know, but where everyone is adept at software engineering and business and has the time to do both and to deal with the eventual stakeholders or whoever's involved. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's really one, and my superimposed 2 Venn diagrams is probably the most sort of evocative slide here, because that's really what's going on. There's these many forces at work on each other, some of which are not even of the same sort of kind or degree as each other, but somehow it has to be made to work. I mean, it's interesting what you say about keeping them separate, because this is also kind of a sidebar, but there's an area where I wish things were kept more separate, and that's between developers and designers. And in the past, I have been pressed into service so many times to twiddle pixels with CSS, it's like, and it's kind of agony sometimes, because it's like, okay, I'll try, and then, oh no, we don't do, we're using Bootstrap, we're not doing that. Oh, okay, I'll try again. And it's like, why is everyone pressed into, this is kind of a rhetorical question, but why does everyone get pressed into service as a designer when they're not? I don't know, it's kind of a strange thing to me. But anyway, yeah, so in the case you're talking about, though, yeah, there's definitely the intertwining makes sense, but again, probably, there are reasons for not literally having them all be the same job description or whatever.
Yeah, and there seem to be different ways of solving the problem. One of them is definitely to stick someone in the middle who kind of knows enough about both. And those people are really, really valuable, but in my experience also end up getting really burned out like fast at some point, right? Because they're just constantly running interference, they're getting it on both sides, and they're trying to, and I think that the other key point that you made there is trust. Like, if you just have trust, if your engineers tell you that they can't do this, or they have to stop and do this, or this thing that you think is simple and it looks simple on the surface is actually much more complicated. If you have a relationship where you can trust, that's another way to move forward. But I think companies that are constantly spending time litigating those things, and where there's great tension between those two, quote, sides, like that's where you just end up with pain.
No, it can be difficult. Yeah, that's true. Another hand, two hands.
Hi, this is from the perspective of the manager having to run interference. So one of the challenges I have is justifying to the business the value in refactoring code, reducing complexity, and so on and so forth, or reducing maintenance costs. The ask back from me is, okay, measure it. And then, in many cases, how do
Sorry,
you
what was it?
measure it?
Measure, yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you measure it in most cases? I mean, because you're asking, let's say you do it, right? How do you know how much it would have taken, how much time it would have taken, how many bugs you would have introduced with the old code, or how many problems you would have had? How do you, like, are there some techniques you could that are known out there? I mean, this is just it's a problem I repeatedly run into, and I haven't really found a solution for it.
The success stories, like the 1200 line controller, I mean, that was a situation where I could make a really strong technical case, a really strong case about Rails and its conventions, and I could say, the reality check is I can't deal with this. It's got whatever number, hundreds of methods or dozens, scores of methods. So in that case, it's kind of anecdotal. It's kind of like, well, I'm here to tell you what the problem is. One thing, going back to the role of manager also, I've seen teams where the running interference partly consists of a sort of vouching for one side or the other, in the sense of, saying to the business, even if you can't measure it, and that is very hard, I don't know how you would do that. It's sort of proving the negative, essentially. But, the manager kind of vouching for the engineering staff and saying, they really did have trouble. They're right. They had trouble, and someone else is going to have trouble, and we're saddled with this code, and it would be worth it. Now, it may turn out there really isn't perceived to be time anyway, but that's something I've seen a lot, is somebody kind of a mediator, so to speak. Again, not to turn it into kind of an antagonistic relationship, but somebody who can reassure either of the all of the parties, the team, the organization, as to what the truth of what people are saying.
I think one of the things that we may be overlooking is code standards. Coding standards in various programming languages, it allows for that art form of code, right?
Sorry,
code can be
allowed to say that once more.
Coding and programming can be an art, like you said,
right,
but it can't be free form. There needs to be some kind of standardization. So one of the things that we employed in our company was that we have certain coding standards, like in Python, you follow PEP 8 standards. Java and other languages also have coding standards. And then when you communicate to the business, you say, okay, if we have, if we don't meet 90% of the coding standards and we have some violations, then we need to refactor. Then we need to modify our code in order to bring it up to those standards. I think that's that happy medium where you don't need to worry about the interferences from the business, because all you need to do is say, well, wait a second, we're not meeting the 90% of the code validations and standards that we mentioned, and we need to work on this more. That's where you get that business justification. I think maybe that might help in other businesses.
I think it can help. I also think you can comply with, linters and style filters and whatever, and still write obscure code. I mean, depending how it's designed and so forth. But yeah, it's certainly a start. And yeah, we tend to have, like on the Python side, we use PyLint, which I think is more or less PEP 8 geared. We're using RuboCop on the Ruby side, which I have great admiration for. Whoever wrote, I don't remember the person or people's name, but RuboCop, whoever wrote that has a very, very deep knowledge of Ruby and is very adept at whatever they did to make it work. It's way too strict, though. It tells you not to do the default, out of the box. And I'm basically bit by bit chiseling away at our default.yaml or whatever it is. So, but yeah, I mean, because it tells you not to do things that are reasonably acceptable. But yeah, so I do think that's important. I think it also might just set a tone. Like I say, you can write obscure code and comply with the linters and so on, but it might, I think it's good because it sets a tone of like, it's not just sort of free form and we don't just all do what we want. I think it's also important in code review to have those kinds of standards. Sometimes if somebody says, well, I can't think of a great example, but something, how you space your parentheses or whatever, I always feel like in code review, you should not just criticize the code because it doesn't look exactly how it would have looked if you had written it. You know what I mean? It's like if your team has standards or well, it passed the linter, that's what we agreed on. If you want to go beyond it, if you see something where you're like, well, we really should agree to do it this way, then bring it up with the team and come up with a working agreement and add that to your, whatever, your documents. But yeah, I mean, you don't want to just say, well, it's, you don't want to get in a ping pong match about things. You have to have some way to resolve them at that level, definitely. Anything else? All right, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.